Welcome back to the Foreign Desk. I'm Lisa Daftari. With us this week, a good friend, colleague, and someone I have admired for a very long time. And if you follow this space, I'm sure you do too. It's Caroline Glick, a senior contributing editor at JNS and also a senior columnist at both JNS and Newsweek. She's also a diplomatic commentator at Israel's Channel 14, a senior fellow for Middle Eastern Affairs at the Center for Security Policy out of Washington, D.C., as well as a lecturer at Israel's College of Statecraft, which is in Jerusalem. She's the author of The Israeli Solution, a one-state plan for peace in the Middle East, and Shackled Warrior, Israel and the Global Jihad. I know Caroline is busy working on a third book, which she might tell us about at the end of the show. She does government and military briefings and has received multiple awards in journalism. And what you may not know about her is as captain in the IDF from 1994 to 1996, Glick was a core member of Israel's negotiating team with the PLO and served as assistant foreign policy advisor to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu from 1997 to 1998. She speaks to us tonight from Efrat, Israel, where she lives currently with her family. Welcome to the show, Caroline.
Thanks so much for having me, Lisa. It's a pleasure to be on your podcast.
Of course, a long time coming. As I mentioned, I think whoever follows the Middle East, particularly the Israeli-Arab conflict, follows your work and has followed it for many years. What was interesting to me is I will admit, I thought, all these years, your writing, your research, your reporting is what made you such a tremendous expert and writer in this arena. But I did not know about your time with the IDF, and I did not know more specifically about your time spent negotiating, meaning having that front row seat in negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians. So when you talk about the challenges, you were there. You saw things happen. You saw exactly why we cannot mend this rift. Can you talk a bit about that and how that has informed your work? More pessimism, more optimism? How has it gone for you?
Well, I think that I saw at the negotiating table the power of self-delusion for Israeli policymakers at that time during the 1990s, because there was a real cognitive dissonance throughout the negotiating process with the PLO. I was a member of Israel's negotiating team at the height of the Oslo years, where we negotiated the major agreements, what's called the interim agreement, where we set down the conditions for the redeployment or the withdrawal of Israeli forces from the major population centers in Judea and Samaria, and transferred a security responsibility and civil responsibility to the PLO over the major population centers between 1994 and 1996, and a slate of other agreements. And during that time, we saw a precipitous rise, the most precipitous, the steepest rise in terrorist attacks in Israel since the 1930s. We were introduced to suicide bombers for the first time in 1994, which is when we had the first suicide bombing in Israel. And all of this was a direct product of bringing the PLO, led by Yasser Arafat, into Israel's heartland. And yet, despite the fact that this was going on in the streets of our cities, and despite the fact that we had very clear both intelligence reporting that the PLO and specifically Yasser Arafat was involved in a lot of this, and we saw it in front of our eyes. And the people that we were negotiating with were also negotiating with Hamas and reaching cooperative agreements with them about, separation of powers and what Hamas was going to do and what the PLO was going to do in terms of terrorism. We saw the lie that the PLO said that they were going to alter their charter, their sort of constitution, which calls in every line for the annihilation of Israel, denies Jewish history, denies Jewish peoplehood, redefines the Jews as this just vagrants, religious minorities, sort of like gypsies that have no homeland, no common history, no common anything. And so they were supposed to massively amend that charter and take out all the parts that called for Israel's elimination. And we saw in real time that they did nothing of the sort. They lied in prime time to President Clinton and to Prime Minister Rabin. And yet,
Yet,
despite all this, we kept deluding ourselves, or our leaders were deluding themselves, that none of this mattered, that as soon as we signed a final peace with the Palestinians, that everything that they were doing and everything that they were saying among themselves and all of the terrorism that they were both enabling and in many cases participating in, was suddenly going to disappear in a poof of smoke, and it was all going to be roses and sunshine and balloons and smiling children and doves of peace, and everything would be fine. And there was literally a mountain that was always rising of Israeli victims of Palestinian terrorism, sitting, at the negotiating table with us, and our leaders were just averting their gazes. So I think, it was an unraveling experience. I was a very young woman. I was in my mid-20s as a young captain in the IDF, and watching this happening, it was a very sobering period in my life, and it very much informed the analyses that I've written, the books that I've written, the lectures that I've given, and really my life's work since, which has been geared toward whether speaking to Americans or speaking to Israelis, speaking to diaspora Jewry, or speaking to Israeli students, military leaders in both countries, is that for policy of any kind to work, it simply must be grounded in reality. And if you're not willing to countenance reality when you begin formulating your policies, you will fail. And not only will you fail, but you'll cause grave harm, particularly when you're dealing with national security, to your nations. And unfortunately, we've seen far too much fantasy-based foreign policy, ideology-based foreign policy, by Israel, by the United States, by the states of the free world, really, since the end of the Cold War.
And one would wonder why you continue in this space, having seen so many dead ends, and having to continue on each day writing as if there will be more chances and there will be some sort of light at the end of all of this that will bring about some sort of peace. And we don't even know what that would look like. But when you speak about that reality, when you speak about that approach, I mean, if you had Bibi's ear right now at this moment, what will it take across the board, not just from Bibi, but from the international community, from the United States, from the UN, from the Europeans, from Israel, from the Palestinians, and all of their different factions? What will it take to get some sort of peace?
Peace is not a rational aim of foreign policy, in the sense that peace is an intangible, and policies, belief systems can be aimed at achieving intangible goals, but policies on a national level need to be geared toward reaching tangible goals. And tangible goals mean things like security, they mean things like national prosperity, they mean uh, diplomatic strength, they mean a sense of national, a sense of morality of your nation and of your existence. And all of these things lead to peace, because the more powerful a nation is, and the more certain it is of the justice of its cause, the more attractive it becomes to partners, and the more it's capable of deterring enemies. And so peace, as the Bible tells us, is predicated on strength. So when you want to pursue peace, you must first pursue strength, and empowering your worst enemies by giving them territory you need to defend yourself, giving them international legitimacy, despite the fact that they remain your enemies, and all of the other things that the peace process with the PLO was predicated on. weaken Israel. They delegitimize Israel because they're empowering a terrorist organization that denies the existence of a Jewish people, denies Jewish history and the right of the Jewish people to their homeland and to self-determination and to political freedom. So if you empower them, you're empowering a force that exists in order to negate your existence. And that's what we did. So that doesn't work. And what we found over the past decade and a half, more or less, particularly since the Arab Spring, is that the biggest impetus for regional peace was twofold. On the one hand, the digital revolution in Israel, the transformation of Israel into a hub of innovation and technology in a technology-based global economy, both increased Israel's national prosperity. Our per capita GDP last year exceeded that of Germany's. We are now over $50,000 per capita income. Just to think about it, at the end of the Cold War, Israel's per capita GDP was 21,000. So we've more than doubled our per capita income, and this is in real dollars. We're much more powerful militarily. And the second thing that happened as a result of the Arab Spring is that the Arabs, the Sunni Arab states, recognized that the forces seeking to destroy Israel, first and foremost, the Islamic Republic of Iran and the Muslim Brotherhood and its aligned terrorist organizations, Al-Qaeda, Hamas, and a host of other ones, are the greatest threats not only to Israel, but to the survival of the Sunni Arab regimes, whether in Egypt or Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, UAE, and so on and so forth. And so they saw that Israel was extremely powerful. They saw that Israel wasn't worried about standing up to the Obama administration when its security required it, in regards to Iran, for instance. And it recognized that the United States, the Sunni Arab world did, was wanting to disengage from the Middle East after the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan had gone sour. And so they began to seek alliances and cooperative arrangements with the Jewish state for the first time. And again, that's real peace. The Abraham Accords that were reached, we met last time I saw you, was at the signing ceremony at the White House lawn in 2020 between Israel and Bahrain and the UAE under the guidance of President Trump. But those accords arose in 2013 and in 2014 with the overthrow of the Muslim Brotherhood regime in Egypt and Israel's support for Sisi, who became the president after being the chief of staff of the army and the defense minister, and for Saudi Arabia and the UAE against the Muslim Brotherhood and against Iran.
Right. And you know what's troubling is about how, the media, social media, this is where people are getting their information and propaganda, frankly, on these topics. They look at something like the Arab Spring and a lot of whether they're Arabs living in these countries or which it's tremendous, right? The amount of support and actual prosperity that has come out of these deals in both public and private deals has been really tremendous in so many different sectors and in so many different ways. What people don't realize is that this was not called the Abraham Accords, but it was called the Peace Through Prosperity and was offered to the Palestinians first.
Right, but the Palestinians didn't want. I mean, that's the Trump peace plan. But Trump also was misguided, I think, in some ways in his policies, in the sense that for the first 3 years of his administration, really, he wasn't interested in a wider Israeli-Arab peace because he still believed that the big prize was the Palestinians. And it was only when the Palestinians rejected his plan and rejected all aspects of his plan and called, his senior advisors curse words, that he recognized that it was time to accept the deal that had been on the table really since 2017, which was regional peace, which was an end to the Arab-Israeli conflict. And the fact is that if he had abandoned his idea that he wanted to get to a peace deal with the Palestinian leadership that fundamentally cannot exist in peaceful coexistence with Israel because they define themselves as Israel's nemesis,
Mhm.
then we would have had Israeli-Saudi peace probably forged formally in 2019.
Right. You bring up two things that I want to touch upon and get your thoughts on. The first is really how the Abraham Accords, like you said, and it was unfortunate that it happened in the final hours, right, of Trump's presidency, where it became kind of like, okay, this idea that we can only accomplish anything in the Middle East is through Palestinian and Israeli peace. If we sidestep that entire narrative and go straight to what do we all have in common, and let's focus on that, and that became, like you said, an entirely new world. And as you said, if we had that under the Trump administration, we would have had Saudis signing on to either the Abraham Accords or some sort of normalization understanding with Israel as well. What it brings us to today is, this really puts into question how important is the United States' approval or guidance or leadership on all of this, right? What do I mean? What is, you know, right now the Biden administration has taken how many months? We just got an invitation for Benjamin Netanyahu to visit the White House after how many years of Biden being in office? And obviously it was the elephant in the room. It was always talked about. Why? And he actually rejected it, and each time for very, very cockamamie reasons, right? It's the judicial reforms inside Israel. Well, you've met with so many heads of state that have human rights problems, that have huge crises going on inside their countries, and you never once mentioned it. What business is it of the United States is what's going on inside Israel? He talked about his cabinet members. He talked, there's so many excuses as to why President Biden has not invited Bibi to the White House, and that has become a very tangible kind of, you can feel palpable, a better word for it, issue. I mean, how damaging is this? And really puts again into question, how important is this relationship for what Israel needs to accomplish in the region?
It's important in and of itself because the United States is the most powerful nation on earth. It's the undisputed superpower in the Middle East. When you look at the Chinese economy right now, you can also understand that, with all due respect to China, and I have an enormous amount of respect for their power and their rise in the region, which is unmistakable and indisputable, China is not a substitute for the United States, either for Israel or for any of the nations of the region. Having said that, um, Israel is not, as I mentioned earlier, we're not a weak nation. We're not dependent on the United States for our financial viability or for our military viability or for our technological viability today in the way that we were in the past. And really, I mean, we don't even really need a formal relationship with the Saudis. We're already talking informally about an agreement, for instance, that will enable cargo transport by trucks
Right.
from the Persian Gulf, from Saudi Arabia through the UAE and Jordan and to the port of Haifa as a land route to Europe, between Europe and Asia, that can serve as a means to bypass or to augment the maritime traffic through the Suez Canal. And that is exceedingly important to the Indians, to the Chinese, who both operate ports in Haifa, as well as to the Europeans, who are increasingly interested in gas from Israel, and they can also receive imports from China and from India through Israel. And these are major ground shaking infrastructure programs and cooperative programs that will simply change the face of the Middle East. The Biden administration talks a lot about integrating Israel into the Middle East. Well, Israel's already integrated into the Middle East, and unfortunately, I fear that what what Biden really wants to do is compel America's partners to accept Iran, which seeks their annihilation, as a legitimate force in the Middle East, which is what the United States' main the focal point of their Middle East strategy appears to be, that is, appeasing and empowering the regime in Tehran
Mhm.
against Israel and Saudi Arabia principally, but against the Sunni Arab states and the Jewish state as a general matter. And so, we would like very much to have a formalized relationship with Saudi Arabia, but the fact is that a lot of the things that such an arrangement, such a formal relationship would enable,
Mhm.
can also be accomplished without such a formalized agreement-based treaty. We can simply do trade agreements. That is, set aside the issue of some declarative uh, uh, pie in the sky kind of notion of normalized relations, and simply act as though our relations are normal, which increasingly they already are anyway.
As an American living in Israel, I mean, it must be very daunting to see that every 4 years or 8 years or so, this formula, which is already extremely difficult and challenging, you have to recalibrate it. And of course, you have to recalibrate it all the time anyway because of the so many enemies surrounding Israel, and they have to kind of have their own calculations as to what needs to happen. But I mean, why hasn't there been in the last, I mean, ever since Obama, right? A this ping ponging in foreign policy when Israel is our main ally and what used to be a very nonpartisan issue that both sides agreed on. Israel is our ally in the region.
Well, I don't think that. I mean, it's got nothing really to do with anything happening in Israel. It has to do exactly with what you're experiencing in the United States. I mean, you have there was a very important article that I read today on Emet Online, EMET Online, about Robert Malley. And I'm actually discussing it in a column that I'm writing about U.S.-Israel relations. And what the author of the article, I don't think he was named actually, but what he argued was that Robert Malley, he comes from a very, very radical background. His father was a Third World revolutionary. He supported Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, and every tin pot Third World dictator, virulently anti-American, virulently anti-Western. And that was the milieu that Robert Malley grew up in. And rather than being shunned by the American foreign policy elite, he was embraced under the Obama administration as Obama transformed the establishment view among Democrats about what the proper aim of American foreign policy is. I mean, Robert Malley thinks that Israel is evil and doesn't have a right to exist. And he's a fellow at the for the Council on Foreign Relations, which is about as establishment as you can get in the United States. So it's not that his radical views are now considered to be establishment views.
Right.
They're shared by his childhood friend, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, by
Mhm.
Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, by Samantha Power, the Director of USAID, and by others, very senior administration officials in charge of the U.S. Middle East policy. So, when you have this kind of changing of a generation, a generational shift, and really it's an epical shift because it's never existed before in American foreign policy, where you have a party whose foreign policy is informed by a very anti-American worldview that rejects Israel's right to exist. I mean, you end up with statements, whether by Ilhan Omar
Right.
or Rashida Tlaib or AOC or Pramila Jayapal, the head of the Progressive Caucus, that
Mhm.
reject Israel's the moral right of the Jewish people to national self-determination. They claim that Zionism or Israel is a racist state. So this is, these are new features in American foreign policy debate. And they fundamentally shift the political calculus in the United States among Democrats. So, I mean, I think from an Israeli perspective, recognizing that still the majority of Democrats and the vast majority of Republicans and the vast majority of Americans support Israel, and that America is a valued ally, that, from our perspective, and we love America and Israel. Israelis are the most pro-American nation in the world. I
Right.
mean, just as an instinctive thing, although Joe Biden has angered, the majority of Israelis who voted for this government, and all he's been doing is boycotting it and demonizing it, and very clearly taking sides with the political opposition against the government in a domestic political dispute
Mhm.
over judicial reform, which is something that, as you said, Americans shouldn't have any interest in, because it's just an internal Israeli debate about governance.
Right.
Um, but I think, what we have to do is, based on our prosperity, our economic wealth, our technological advantages, I think that Israel should bow out of the Memorandum of Understanding on military assistance to the United States. The United States currently provides Israel. There's an important article about this in Tablet that I'm also discussing in my article that I'm writing now. The United States gives Israel $3.8 billion in military aid a year, which is a lot, except Israel doesn't get any of it. I mean, all of it is spent in the United States. They're basically subsidies for U.S. defense contractors, and it's just that rather than transferring the hardware and the platforms to American forces, they're transferred to Israel.
Mhm.
But as a result, we lose $1.3 billion directly as a baseline every year in contracts that we don't give to ourselves. And jobs lost, tens of thousands of jobs in our defense industries are lost every year because of this. And then possible markets for exports of Israeli products. So I think the idea has to be that Israel behave like an ally, a junior partner, but not a client state any longer, and that our long-term procurement policies and our policies for cooperation with the United States and partnership with the United States should be based on partnerships rather than handouts. And that I think that's better for us. I think it's better for the United States. I think it's better for American Jews not to be caught in the middle of this, and to be attacked all the time for caring too much about Israel, when you see an increase all the time of progressive anti-Semitism in the United States over, and this is used as a cudgel against the American Jewish community. I think for all of those reasons, we should be moving to pivot from a relationship of client state, which made sense 30 years ago, to an actual reflection of what we bring to bear, how we can help the United States, and how we can most benefit from our alliance with the United States at this time. And that's a kind of approach that will be less vulnerable to the results of whatever election. It'll be based on
Right.
clear-cut shared interests.
Right. That will be consistent and like you said, not at the whim of what goes on social media or at the White House. You covered so many of the points I wanted to get to. Of course, President Herzog visiting Washington this week, speaking to Congress, and of course, our favorite friends, the radicals inside Congress, have already held up their apartheid signs and have made it known that they will not be attending. This is the issue, Caroline, and as you know very well, day in and day out, these are the people and these are the voices that are controlling the narrative on social media and popular opinion about Israel. And we'd like to believe, like you said, that natural relationship and the strength between Israel and the United States is just it's innate. It belongs there and will continue for many years to come, despite what we see on Instagram and on among four or five women who are just very radicalized inside Congress and want to spread their influence there. Caroline, I don't want to take up more of your time. Tell us about this book that you're working on. I know people will be waiting for it, and where they could read your latest work.
So my articles always appear, just so you know, on jns.org or on carolynglick.com. And you can also watch my own podcast, Carolyn Glick Show, on both the jns.org website and YouTube channel, and also on the Carolyn Glick Show channels on YouTube and on Rumble, or any of the places where you get podcasts. So that's one thing. And regarding the book, I think we've had an organized campaign of political warfare, actually, by our left against our government since it came into office in January. And what they're claiming is that a very limited, I think too limited, but whatever the case, uh, package of judicial reform bills that the justice minister put forward in January, um, that's going to transform Israel into a dictatorship. And basically, what was presented was a very, like I said, a very modest package to place minimal limits on the powers of the Israeli Supreme Court. You have justices in the United States like the late Antonin Scalia and the retired federal appellate court judge Richard Posner, as well as Robert Bork, have all come out very clearly and said that Israel's Supreme Court there's nothing that compares to it in the entire world because it's an imperial court. It has veto power through judicial writ of all executive decisions and laws duly promulgated by our Knesset. And it has no restrictions on its power because it hasn't accepted any. It's seized for itself, invented for itself, really, the power to abrogate laws and government policies based not on law, but on what they've invented, which is called a reasonableness standard, and which is completely subjective.
Right.
And so they say that if they get to decide, these unelected, actually self-selected judges get to decide whether a policy or a law is unreasonable, and if it is, and if they claim that it is, in their opinion, then they can strike it down. And there's no recourse for the government or for the Knesset under those circumstances. So we have a very, very problematic legal system in Israel, and it goes to all levels of the legal system, including the government attorneys and the state prosecution and the legal advisors to the ministers. So he put forward a very limited proposal that would place very small limits on that power. And as a result, the left has just set Israel on fire. And I've decided that, it's very important to explain what's happening to Americans. Americans usually look at Israel from the prism of its national security, from looking at it from the perspective of the Palestinian conflict with Israel, or Iran's threats to annihilate Israel and Iran's nuclear weapons program and what have you, or from a biblical perspective that Israel is the reinstatement of the ancient kingdoms of Israel that are in the Bible, that the Bible is based on, and what that means for Christians in the United States and around the world. It's fundamental and it's extraordinary. But Israel is also a living, breathing country. We have a significant issue with what you call your deep state in Israel. We have entrenched elites who are very unabashed about using their power and referring to themselves as elites and gatekeepers that protect Israel's institutions from the hordes called voters who elect the wrong people to office. So I thought, the debate in Israel, because our media leans very far to the left, has been very distorted. And the debate in the United States, or the discussion such as it is of the current events in Israel, has been predicated on the Israeli media, which means that it's doubly distorted. And then it's simplified by reporters who don't understand what they're writing about, um, to try to explain it to the regular American news consumer who knows even less. And as a result, you're getting these discussions in the United States about how Israel is ceasing to be a democracy that are completely at odds, and I mean 180 degrees with what's actually happening on the ground. So I decided that, there's always a question of, risk aversion. How much of your dirty laundry do you want to place outside your door? But I think that, in this case, it's very important, particularly because you experience very similar tumult in the United States with the Black Lives Matter riots in the summer of 2020, and with a lot of the polarization that you're seeing in American politics over there. So, in a lot of ways, there are very clear parallels between what's happening here and what's been going on in the United States. And I think it's important, particularly for American Jews and for Christian Zionists and for everybody who supports a strong, vibrant, and democratic Jewish state, to have a much clearer understanding of what is going on here. Hence the book.
I'm so glad that you said this about the book, because I did want to ask you about the judicial reform, but we were out of time. So this was perfect, a little bonus for us. So I did want to get your
Thank you.
perspective on how we got so distorted on really just wholesalely, like, describing these reforms as paragraphs, as changing the entire landscape of the country. People even throw in concepts like abortion is going to be taken away, and a lot of lies. And I thank you for the hard work that you do in correcting these narratives day in and day out. And we look forward to reading your book, to understanding these reforms better, and understanding the political landscape inside Israel better. It's a work in progress, but it is still the only democracy in the Middle East. And those who are criticizing it to no end, I mean, put things in perspective. It's truly a shame. Thank you, Caroline. Thank you so much for your hard work. And please, I encourage you to
Lisa.
get on her newsletter. She does put out a newsletter with all of her latest and greatest. Grab her books, read her columns, and follow her on social media. Thank you so much, Caroline Glick. And for those of you who would like to subscribe to our weekly podcast, go to youtube.com/Lisa Daftari. You can also get it wherever you get your podcasts. And to subscribe to our daily top 10 email, go to foreigndesknews.com. See you all next week.